Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to your next mini lesson in Cornell Notes assignment. Today we're going to be discussing the American Dream, F. Scott Fitzgerald, whose book The Great Gatsby we will be reading over the next few weeks, and the idea of a new cultural identity in the role of the Harlem Renaissance in American literature. We're going to be studying the Restoration, the Roaring Twenties, and modernism during this unit, and this is kind of your first step in understanding the historical context surrounding these eras. Do be sure to take those Cornell notes following that format. Please remember that a summary is necessary in order to complete the notes. If you have any questions, be sure to reach out to your instructor. Let's get underway. In the United States, the closing decades of the 19th century were a time of rapid change and sharp contrasts. Great entrepreneurs, such as Andrew Carnegie, J.P. Morgan, John D. Rockefeller, and Cornelius Vanderbilt, amassed vast fortunes by exploiting cheap labor in the cities and creating giant companies that controlled entire industries. Urban manufacturing centers swelled with the influx of immigrants from Europe and people from rural areas in search of work. Almost half the U.S. population was crowded in about a dozen cities, and the majority of all U.S. workers were industrial laborers sweating in factories. As the new century dawned, the belief in America as a unique place where work and merit, rather than social privilege, determines one's fate remained a powerful ideal. Everyone knew of Abraham Lincoln's rise from his early life in a simple log cabin in rural Illinois. Many also knew that the millionaire newspaperman Joseph Pulitzer had come to America as a poor young German-speaking immigrant recruited to fight in the Civil War. Stories of people who had risen through their own efforts from humble beginnings to achieve fabulous success were told and retold. For many writers, however, the underside of this ideal was that the flaws hidden beneath its optimistic simplicity became a preoccupation. In the novel, Sister Carrie, Theodore Dreiser challenged the notion of self-improvement by depicting a heroine crushed by forces she cannot control. In The Jungle, Upton Sinclair exposed the appalling working conditions of immigrants in the Chicago stockyards. The poet and singer Carl Sandburg presented the steamy side of urban industrialization, the poverty of the crime, the corruption, even as he celebrated the courage and resilience of everyday men and women in the face of these blights. In their poetry, Edgar Lee Masters and Edwin Arlington Robinson turned their gaze away from cities to look at the changes surging through rural areas at the time. Each investigated in a different way the currents of discontent running beneath the surface stability of small-town life. Paul Laurence Dunbar, the first African-American to earn his living solely by his writing, made his own sharp points in America's picturesque veneer by exposing the truth behind popular racial stereotypes of the day. The American dream of material success was nowhere so minutely explored as in the stories and novels of F. Scott Fitzgerald. Nearly all of his work is the same, and concerns the tensions between the very wealthy and those, like him, who were attracted to them. In following the lives of characters whose fate are determined by their responses to wealth and to those who possess it, he gave us an intimate insight into the American preoccupation with money. For more than 20 million immigrants who came to America in the years between 1870 and 1920, the American dream was not just a compelling ideal, but a last chance at survival. Many found work building skyscrapers, bridges, subways, and trolley lines in the growing cities. Anzia Yezierska's moving account of delusion and persistence in her story American Eye provides a glimpse of what life was like for immigrants in the sweatshops of New York City's garment district. Although the great waves of immigrants from Europe subsided during the 1920s after the passage of the restrictive quota laws and during the Great Depression of the 1930s, the United States continued to be a land of opportunity for those in need. In the 1960s, quotas based on nationality were lifted and another wave of immigration began. The immigrants came mainly from Asia and the West Indies rather than from Europe. These new immigrants came for the same reason as their predecessors a century before, to make a better life for themselves and their families. But some were also escaping homelands scarred by war and political persecution. Just Jen's story in the American Society and Naomi Shihab's Nye's poem, My Father and the Fig Tree, treat the immigrant experience with humor. Ivan Sapia's poem Defining the Grateful Gesture and Lorna D. Cervantes' poem Refugee Ship look at generational differences in immigration families. In the 1920s, another piece of the puzzle comes through a new cultural identity within the Harlem Renaissance. The Harlem Renaissance was an unprecedented period of literacy, musical, and artistic production among African Americans that reached its peak in the 1920s. This movement was centered in the Harlem section of Manhattan in New York City, a magnet for thousands of blacks migrating from the South, the Midwest, and even the West Indies. Southern blacks in particular were fleeing poverty and growing racial violence, hoping to find more economic and personal freedom in the North. Politically, the Renaissance years were an extremely difficult time for African Americans. During the Red Summer of 1919, there was a bloody anti-black riots in 26 cities, including Chicago and Washington, D.C. In the 1920s, membership in the terrorist white supremacist Ku Klux Klan rose to more than 4 million nationwide. Not only a magnet for blacks, Harlem drew whites as well. Tourists flocked to night spots such as the Cotton Club to hear the new jazz music played by Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington. And white writers, publishers, and patrons of the arts developed a keen interest in Harlem residents and their culture. For African Americans, a new cultural identity crystallized during the Harlem Renaissance. It was the time of the new Negro, in the words of philosopher Alain Locke, who first defined the movement. It rejected beast-like or sentimental stereotypes, claiming the rights to define themselves and defend themselves against attack. It was this feeling of collective identity. These writers had pride in their race and asserted its contributions to American culture. At the same time, they possessed an international consciousness, recognizing kinship among blacks in the United States, West Indies, and Africa. Such an international outlook was advocated by Marcus Garvey, a Jamaican immigrant whose popular Back to Africa movement called on African Americans to leave the United States and form their own nation. The writers of the Harlem Renaissance embodied these ideals. Langston Hughes was one of the most original and important. In 1925, he published his first poetry collection, The Weary Blues, following it with dozens of volumes of poetry, fiction, plays, and essays over a career lasting in the 1960s. He praised blackness, embraced common people as subjects, and blended elements of blues and jazz into his work. The exuberant Zora Neale Hurston, raised in a small, all-black Florida town and trained in anthropology at Barnard College, also drew upon African-American folk traditions. Her stories, novels, essays, and folklore collections reflect a love of black language and manners. Hurston was one of the first writers to present African Americans as complete, multifaceted human beings. Other important Renaissance writers were James Weldon Johnson, Claude McKay, Countee Cullen, and Arna Bontemps, all whom showed mastery of traditional literary forms important to the new expressions of individual and collective feeling. Yet another significant figure was Jean Toomer, whose Experimental Cane, written in 1923, blended poetry and prose to evoke the beautiful, terrible South of black experience. The Great Depression of the 1930s brought an end to the Harlem Renaissance, causing many of the writers who had gathered in Harlem to scatter and take other jobs to support themselves. But their work planted seeds that continued to generate important writing from the African American experience. In 1950, the poet Gwendolyn Brooks became the first African American to win a Pulitzer Prize. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, James Baldwin, who left the United States and the racism he felt here to live in Paris, gave us some of the most important essays of the period. Essays based on his experiences and struggles with racial identity. And in contemporary times, Toni Morrison has become one of the most accomplished American novelists, winning nearly every important literary award, including the Nobel Prize for Literature. In her essay in this part of Unit 6 that you can read, Morrison demonstrates the continuing effort to find and present the essentials of African American life. If you have any questions, ladies and gentlemen, be sure to reach out to your instructors. Be sure to fill out your Cornell notes completely, and we'll see you next time.